Some good news. Should we dream for a moment that the woke mind virus might just be on its deathbed? According to Pew Research, 52% of American workers have been trained in diversity, equity and inclusion at a cost, can you believe it, of $8 billion a year to industry. But DEI policies, popularised in 2020 after the death of George Floyd, well, they're starting to be wound back as people get sick to death of being pitted against each other. Walmart is the latest corporation to announce they are completely abandoning DEI policies. And this is not a tweak, this is an absolute overhaul of all of their policies. Here's what they've announced. They've announced that they will close down their Equity Racial Centre, which they established in 2020 at a cost of $100 million. That's gone. They've said they're no longer going to take into account the racial and gender mix of suppliers when ordering contracts. They've said they're no longer going to monitor LGBTQ plus inclusion in their workplace. But more than that, they're going to review the sponsorship of all Pride events so they're not financially supporting anything that sexualises children, which basically means they won't be supporting any Pride events. And on top of that, they're reviewing all of their products and getting rid of anything that sexualises or promotes trans and non-binary products to children. Now, bear in mind, Walmart employ 1.8 million Americans. So this is a big deal, but they're not the first company to do this. The Ford Motor Company, Lowe's, Boeing, Harley-Davidson have all announced prior to Walmart's announcement that they too are abandoning DEI principles. So, Joe and Liz, here's my question. Yes. Is this because of Trump, or was this already happening and Trump kind of tapped into a groundswell that existed already and is growing stronger, not just in America, but maybe here in Australia as well? Dare we dream?
I think this was definitely already happening as these companies just came to bear with what they were actually doing and going, what are we getting out of this? It's certainly not floating with our base. On top of the companies that you've already listed, there's John Deere, Tractor Supply, Molson Coors, Jack Daniels. I think they've just realised we're spending all these money on this DEI initiatives. It's simply not floating with our customer base. And perhaps just the general question of, what are we doing this anyway? Like, John Deere is a tractor company. What interest do you have in DEI, in preaching to people, whether it be your employees or your clients, your customers, about this kind of thing? Also, what helps really get this on the nose is a new study by a place called Network Contagion Research Institute, NCRI, in America. They've done some study on these DEI practices, which are very prolific, not just in workplaces, but in schools, in universities, very much in America, and as we know, here in Australia as well. So here's the guy who headed up this study. His name is...
How do you know it's a him, Liz?
Finkelstein. He said what we did in this study was we took a lot of these ideas that were found to still be very prominent in a lot of these DEI lectures and interventions and training, and we said, well, how is this going to affect people? What we found is that when people are exposed to this ideology, what happens is they become hostile without any indication that anything racist actually happened. These findings from this research were so shocking and forceful that the authors automatically, they'd use 324 participants in the original piece of work, in which they gave some people just a completely race-neutral piece of text on corn of all topics to read, and then they gave other participants these really race-baity articles by well-known Kendi and D'Angelo, who are really big on all things racism. So they got all these participants together, and then they gave them a completely race-neutral scenario in which a student is rejected from college, and they asked for these people's responses. Well, the research was absolutely comprehensive. The implications of these findings can simply not be downplayed. The research clearly showed that instead of achieving equality, dismantling systemic oppression, which is what all these DEI tick boxes are supposed to be doing, they may well, in fact, be deepening divisions and this cultural resentment between races. So well done to all the corporations spending $8 billion a year on this rubbish. You may well be undermining the very cause that you claim to be promoting. Now, this research was, like I say, so comprehensive, so decisive. The researchers couldn't believe it, and they said, OK, let's go again. We'll do the exact same thing, but with almost 3 times the amount of participants. So this time they got together just under 1,000 people, much bigger set of participants there, and they found exactly the same thing. They got exactly the same research data back. I think it's absolutely incredible as well that this research has been suppressed. The New York Times refused to touch it, despite the fact that they had over 20 times previously publicised the NCRI's findings on other research that they'd done. And Bloomberg just turned around and said, not on your life. The editor was like, I'm not touching this. We're all about DEI, so God forbid we let people know that, in fact, research shows this stuff ain't even working. Not only is it not working, it's undermining the very causes we think that we're achieving. It's just incredible, Joe. Nobody wants to admit the failure.
It is incredible. I mean, I suppose what the report's trying to get at is that if you are told that racism is absolutely everywhere and that you've got to be hyper vigilant and look for it everywhere because it is everywhere and you just haven't been seeing it before, then obviously you're going to see it everywhere. And the problem with seeing it everywhere is then you miss it when it actually matters and when it's real. And so this is the whole problem with anything to do with identity politics or race-based politics. It doesn't address the disadvantage that someone may or may not be suffering because of their race. It just means that you see racism everywhere, and you are more likely to see all this racism and indeed experience all this racism if you are alive to, awake to, or if you will, woke to the racism, which means that it is usually the most overprivileged, tertiary educated, affluent, well-educated people, and I use that in air quotes, who feel the most racially oppressed, even though they are in fact the most privileged of their race, typically. So that is why it is completely perverse and backward, and it's why I think we should always see things in terms of disadvantage instead of seeing things in terms of racism. So, all right, who is worse off? Who is really suffering? Now, there's no question that, for example, there are Indigenous communities in Australia that are terribly disadvantaged and have horrible outcomes in terms of violence, substance abuse, health, educational outcomes, job opportunities, all that sort of stuff. But you focus on those disadvantages and you fix them rather than saying, OK, well, because this terrible disadvantage is happening in Wilcannia, we better make sure that we're not racist to, affluent Indigenous people who just happen to be Indigenous but living in, say, inner city Wallara or Glebe or Newtown or Northcote. And so the whole problem with seeing things through the lens of race, through the lens of colour, is it actually ignores disadvantage. And that is why it is so attractive to the new left, if you like, so the east and west coast elites, because they can claim disadvantage, they can claim oppression, they can say, oh, I've been, hi, I'm from MSNBC and I'm discriminated against because despite the fact I earn $300,000 a year, I'm black. Whereas instead of ignoring the fact that there are heaps of disadvantaged people who are not getting a look in because rich, privileged elites are soaking up all the oppression for themselves because they're the ones who are alive to it and can see it everywhere. It's a sickness.